Part II. Combray. Section 16. And it was at that moment, too, thanks to a peasant who went past, apparently in a bad enough humor already, but more so when he nearly received my umbrella in his face, and who replied without any cordiality to my "Fine day, what? Good to be out walking," that I learned that identical emotions do not spring up in the hearts of all men simultaneously, by a pre-established order. Later on I discovered that whenever I had read for too long, and was in a mood for conversation, the friend to whom I would be burning to say something would at that moment have finished indulging himself in the delights of conversation, and wanted nothing now but to be left to read undisturbed. And if I had been thinking with affection of my parents, and forming the most sensible and proper plans for giving them pleasure, they would have been using the same interval of time to discover some misdeed that I had already forgotten, and would begin to scold me severely just as I flung myself upon them with a kiss. Sometimes to the exhilaration which I derived from being alone would be added an alternative feeling, so that I could not be clear in my mind to which I should give the casting vote. A feeling stimulated by the desire to see rise up before my eyes a peasant girl whom I might clasp in my arms. Coming abruptly, and without giving me time to trace it accurately to its source among so many ideas of a very different kind, the pleasure which accompanied this desire seemed only a degree superior to what was given me by my other thoughts. I found an additional merit in everything that was in my mind at the moment, in the pink reflection of the tiled roof, the wild grass in the wall, the village of Roussainville, into which I had long desired to penetrate, the trees of its wood and the steeple of its church, created in them by this fresh emotion which made them appear more desirable only because I thought it was they that had provoked it, and which seemed only to wish to bear me more swiftly towards them when it filled my sails with a potent, unknown, and propitious breeze. But if this desire that a woman should appear added for me something more exalting than the charms of nature, they in their turn enlarged what I might in the woman's charm have found too much restricted. It seemed to me that the beauty of the trees was hers also, and that, as for the spirit of those horizons, of the village of Roussainville, of the books which I was reading that year, it was her kiss which would make me master of them all. And, my imagination drawing strength from contact with my sensuality expanding through all the realms of my imagination, my desire had no longer any bounds. Moreover, just as in moments of musing contemplation of nature, the normal actions of the mind being suspended, and our abstract ideas of things set on one side, we believe with the profoundest faith in the originality, in the individual existence of the place in which we may happen to be. The passing figure which my desire evoked seemed to be not any one example of the general type of woman, but a necessary and natural product of the soil. For at that time everything which was not myself, the earth and the creatures upon it, seemed to me more precious, more important, endowed with a more real existence than they appear to full-grown men. And between the earth and its creatures I made no distinction. I had a desire for a peasant girl from Méséglise or Roussainville, for a fisher girl from Balbec, just as I had a desire for Balbec and Méséglise. The pleasure which those girls were empowered to give me would have seemed less genuine, I should have had no faith in it any longer, if I had been at liberty to modify its conditions as I chose. To meet in Paris a fisher girl from Balbec, or a peasant girl from Méséglise, would have been like receiving the present of a shell which I had never seen upon the beach, or of a fern which I had never found among the woods, would have stripped from the pleasure which she was about to give me all those other pleasures in the thick of which my imagination had enwrapped her. But to wander thus among the woods of Roussainville, without a peasant girl to embrace, was to see those woods and yet know nothing of their secret treasure, their deep hidden beauty. That girl whom I never saw, save dappled with the shadows of their leaves, was to me herself a plant of local growth, only taller than the rest, and one whose structure would enable me to approach more closely than in them to the intimate savor of the land from which she had sprung. I could believe this all the more readily, and also that the caresses by which she would bring that savor to my senses were themselves of a particular kind, yielding a pleasure which I could never derive from any but herself, since I was still, and must for long remain, in that period of life when one has not yet separated the fact of this sensual pleasure from the various women in whose company one has tasted it, when one has not reduced it to a general idea which makes one regard them thenceforward as the variable instruments of a pleasure that is always the same. Indeed, that pleasure does not exist, isolated and formulated in the consciousness, as the ultimate object with which one seeks a woman's company, or as the cause of the uneasiness which, in anticipation, one then feels. Hardly even does one think of oneself, but only how to escape from oneself. Obscurely awaited, imminent and concealed, it rouses to such a paroxysm, at the moment when at last it makes itself felt, those other pleasures which we find in the tender glance, in the kiss of her who is by our side, that it seems to us more than anything else a sort of transport of gratitude for the kindness of heart of our companion, and for her touching predilection of ourselves, which we measure by the benefits, by the happiness that she showers upon us. Alas! It was in vain that I implored the dungeon keep of Roussainville, that I begged it to send out to meet me some daughter of its village, appealing to it as to the sole confidant to whom I had disclosed my earliest desire, when from the top floor of our house at Combray, from the little room that smelt of orris root, I had peered out and seen nothing but its tower, framed in the square of the half open window. While with the heroic scruples of a traveller setting forth for unknown climes, or of a desperate wretch hesitating on the verge of self‐destruction, faint with emotion, I explored across the bounds of my own experience an untrodden path which I believed might lead me to my death even, until passion spent itself and left me shuddering among the sprays of flowering currant, which, creeping in through the window, tumbled all about my body. In vain I called upon it now. In vain I compressed the whole landscape into my field of vision, draining it with an exhaustive gaze which sought to extract from it a female creature. I might go alone as far as the porch of Saint André des Champs. Never did I find there the girl whom I should inevitably have met had I been with my grandfather, and so unable to engage her in conversation. I would fix my eyes, without limit of time, upon the trunk of a distant tree, from behind which she must appear and spring towards me. My closest scrutiny left the horizon barren as before. Night was falling. Without any hope now would I concentrate my attention, as though to force up out of it the creatures which it must conceal, upon that sterile soil, that stale and outworn land. And it was no longer in lightness of heart, but with sullen anger, that I aimed blows at the trees of Roussainville Wood, from among which no more living creatures made their appearance than if they had been trees painted on the stretched canvas background of a panorama. When, unable to resign myself to having to return home without having held in my arms the woman I so greatly desired, I was yet obliged to retrace my steps towards Combray, and to admit to myself that the chance of her appearing in my path grew smaller every moment. And if she had appeared, would I have dared to speak to her? I felt that she would have regarded me as mad, for I no longer thought of those desires which came to me on my walks, but were never realized, as being shared by others, or as having any existence apart from myself. They seemed nothing more now than the purely subjective, impotent, illusory creatures of my temperament. They were in no way connected now with nature, with the world of real things, which from now onwards lost all its charm and significance, and meant no more to my life than a purely conventional framework, just as the action of a novel is framed in the railway carriage, on a seat of which a traveller is reading it to pass the time. And it is perhaps from another impression which I received at Montgevin, some years later, an impression which at that time was without meaning, that there arose long afterwards my idea of that cruel side of human passion called sadism. We shall see in due course that for quite another reason the memory of this impression was to play an important part in my life. It was during a spell of very hot weather. My parents, who had been obliged to go away for the whole day, had told me that I might stay out as late as I pleased, and having gone as far as the Montgevin pond, where I enjoyed seeing again the reflection of the tiled roof of the hut, I had lain down in the shade and gone to sleep among the bushes on the steep slope that rose up behind the house, just where I had waited for my parents years before, one day when they had gone to call on Monsieur Von Toye. It was almost dark when I awoke, and I wished to rise and go away. But I saw Mademoiselle Von Toye, or thought, at least, that I recognized her, for I had not seen her often at Combray, and then only when she was still a child, whereas she was now growing into a young woman, who probably had just come in, standing in front of me and only a few feet away from me, in that room in which her father had entertained mine, and which she had now made into a little sitting room for herself. The window was partly open. The lamp was lighted. I could watch her every movement without her being able to see me. But, had I gone away, I must have made a rustling sound among the bushes. She would have heard me, and might have thought that I had been hiding there in order to spy upon her. She was in deep mourning, for her father had but lately died. We had not gone to see her. My mother had not cared to go, on account of that virtue which alone in her fixed any bounds to her benevolence, namely, modesty. But she pitied the girl from the depths of her heart. My mother had not forgotten the sad end of Monsieur Von Toye's life, his complete absorption, first in having to play both mother and nursery maid to his daughter, and later in the suffering which she had caused him. She could see the tortured expression which was never absent from the old man's face in those terrible last years. She knew that he had definitely abandoned the task of transcribing in fair copies the whole of his later work, the poor little pieces, we imagined, of an old music master, a retired village organist, which, we assumed, were of little or no value in themselves, though we did not despise them, because they were of such great value to him, and had been the chief motive of his life before he sacrificed them to his daughter; pieces which, being mostly not even written down, but recorded only in his memory, while the rest were scribbled on loose sheets of paper and quite illegible, must now remain unknown forever. My mother thought also of that other and still more cruel renunciation to which Monsieur Von Toye had been driven, that of seeing the girl happily settled with an honest and respectable future. When she called to mind all this utter and crushing misery that had come upon my aunt's old music master, she was moved to very real grief, and shuddered to think of that other grief, so different in its bitterness, which Mademoiselle Von Toye must now be feeling, tinged with remorse at having virtually killed her father. "Poor Monsieur Von Toye," my mother would say. "He lived for his daughter, and now he has died for her, without getting his reward. Will he get it now, I wonder, and in what form? It can only come to him from her." At the far end of Mademoiselle Von Toye's sitting room, on the mantelpiece, stood a small photograph of her father, which she went briskly to fetch, just as the sound of carriage wheels was heard from the road outside, then flung herself down on a sofa and drew close beside her a little table on which she placed the photograph, just as long ago Monsieur Von Toye had placed beside him the piece of music which he would have liked to play over to my parents. And then her friend came in. Mademoiselle Von Toye greeted her without rising, clasping her hands behind her head, and drew her body to one side of the sofa as though to make room. But no sooner had she done this than she appeared to feel that she was perhaps suggesting a particular position to her friend with an emphasis which might well be regarded as importunate. She thought that her friend would prefer, no doubt, to sit down at some distance from her upon a chair. She felt that she had been indiscreet. Her sensitive heart took fright. Stretching herself out again over the whole of the sofa, she closed her eyes and began to yawn, so as to indicate that it was a desire to sleep, and that alone, which had made her lie down there. Despite the rude and hectoring familiarity with which she treated her companion, I could recognize in her the obsequious and reticent advances, the abrupt scruples and restraints which had characterized her father. Presently she rose and came to the window, where she pretended to be trying to close the shutters, and not succeeding. "Leave them open," said her friend. "I am hot." "But it's too dreadful. People will see us," Mademoiselle Von Toye answered. And then she guessed probably that her friend would think that she had uttered these words simply in order to provoke a reply in certain other words, which she seemed indeed to wish to hear spoken, but, from prudence, would let her friend be the first to speak. And so, although I could not see her face clearly enough, I am sure that the expression must have appeared on it which my grandmother had once found so delightful, when she hastily went on, "When I say see us, I mean, of course, see us reading. It's so dreadful to think that in every trivial little thing you do some one may be overlooking you." With the instinctive generosity of her nature, a courtesy beyond her control, she refrained from uttering the studied words which, she had felt, were indispensable for the full realization of her desire. And perpetually, in the depths of her being, a shy and suppliant maiden would kneel before that other element, the old campaigner, battered but triumphant, would intercede with him and oblige him to retire. "Oh, yes! It is so extremely likely that people are looking at us at this time of night in this densely populated district," said her friend with bitter irony. "And what if they are?" she went on, feeling bound to annotate with a malicious yet affectionate wink these words which she was repeating out of good nature, like a lesson prepared beforehand which she knew it would please Mademoiselle Vontoya to hear. "And what if they are? All the better that they should see us." Mademoiselle Von Toya shuddered and rose to her feet. In her sensitive and scrupulous heart she was ignorant what words ought to flow spontaneously from her lips, so as to produce the scene for which her eager senses clamored. She reached out as far as she could across the limitations of her true character to find the language appropriate to a vicious young woman such as she longed to be thought. But the words which, she imagined, such a young woman might have uttered with sincerity sounded unreal in her own mouth; and what little she allowed herself to say was said in a strained tone, in which her ingrained timidity paralyzed her tendency to freedom and audacity of speech; while she kept on interrupting herself with, "You're sure you aren't cold? You aren't too hot? You don't want to sit and read by yourself?" "Your ladyship's thoughts seem to be rather warm this evening," she concluded, doubtless repeating a phrase which she had heard used on some earlier occasion by her friend. In the V-shaped opening of her crape bodice Mademoiselle Von Toya felt the sting of her friend's sudden kiss. She gave a little scream and ran away. And then they began to chase one another about the room, scrambling over the furniture, their wide sleeves fluttering like wings, clucking and crowing like a pair of amorous fowls. At last Mademoiselle Von Toya fell down exhausted upon the sofa, where she was screened from me by the stooping body of her friend. But the latter now had her back turned to the little table on which the old music master's portrait had been arranged. Mademoiselle Von Toya realized that her friend would not see it unless her attention were drawn to it, and so exclaimed, as if she herself had just noticed it for the first time, "Oh, there's my father's picture looking at us. I can't think who can have put it there. I'm sure I've told them 20 times that is not the proper place for it." End of Part 2, Section 16.